Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining my webinar today. I'm Nikki Potts, and I'm just going to give it a couple of a minute for everyone to start signing in. Sometimes it takes a few minutes to log in, get the screen up and running. So just a few housekeeping. The session today will run for about half an hour. If we go a bit quick, we might have a bit of time for question at the end, and I'll review them if you type it in the Q&A section. The first part of the webinar, I'll generally cover a bit of theory about the system and risk tolerance, and then the second half will be a little bit more hands-on, where I will be demonstrating the system live from the site. So I think we've got about the right number of attendees now, so I'll just kick ahead. So this session will cover, the first part is, what is risk tolerance? It's a quick introduction to risk tolerance and FinaMetrica for those who are new to FinaMetrica. Then we're going to look at the risk tolerance report in detail and applying the results of the report when developing appropriate asset allocation. And finally, we're going to jump into managing clients' expectations in regards to risk and return. So just to start, what is risk tolerance? So risk tolerance is psychological. It's how an individual feels emotionally about taking risk. So if you can think of a continuum from minimizing unfavorable outcomes to maximizing favorable outcomes, where you sit along that continuum is your risk tolerance. Now, a good analogy I like to think of is, have you ever been a passenger in a car where the driver seems to be either going too fast or too slow? The speed is obviously right to the driver, but you're uncomfortable. Either you're anxious that there will be an accident, or you're impatient, wondering why he or she is just creeping along. Now, many factors determine a person's driving behavior, but a key element is the person's tolerance for risk. The fast driver has a higher risk tolerance than you, and the slow driver has a lower risk tolerance than you. There are actually 5 types of risk tolerance. Now, research has shown that there are physical risk tolerance, health and safety, social risk tolerance, and ethical risk tolerance. Obviously, what we're going to concern ourselves with today is financial risk tolerance. Now, people behave consistently within type, but not across types. So someone who takes physical risks, such as going bungee jumping or mountain climbing, may not necessarily take the same level of risk in their financial decision making. Until recently, the existence of the 5 types was not known in the financial services industry, and financial risk tolerance questionnaires often include questions about other types of risk that are not financial, which leads to invalid results. Like many human attributes, an individual's risk tolerance is thought to be a combination of nature and nurture. So in psychology, it is classed as a psychological trait, i.e., a relatively enduring way one individual differs from another. So risk tolerance is generally stable, but not set in concrete. We know that events, either good or bad, such as getting married, coming into a big windfall, or a death in the family, can cause a change in personal traits such as personality. So it would likely to have an effect on risk tolerance as well. This means that retesting after the event should be done to capture any possible change. Otherwise, every 2 to 3 years is sufficient, and I'll explain this in the next section. The relationship with demographic factors. So we know that males on average are more risk tolerant than females. It's not a surprise here. The difference is about the same as the difference between male and female heights. We also know that marriage tends to decrease risk tolerance marginally. Remember that for couples, each must assess their risk tolerance separately. Just like you don't complete a joint personality test, you don't complete a joint risk tolerance test. It is common for couples to have different risk tolerance profiles. Managing these differences in couples is both challenging and rewarding. Your clients will have a better appreciation of why their partner may make certain financial decisions. We also know that risk tolerance is positively correlated with education, income and wealth. So that as these increase, so does risk tolerance, but only slightly. And risk tolerance is negatively correlated with age. As age increases, risk tolerance decreases, and at an accelerating rate. Now, in the previous slides, I mentioned that retesting should be done after a major life event. So in addition, periodic assessment every 2 to 3 years is advisable to capture any age-related changes. And finally, as the number of dependents increases, risk tolerance decreases, but again, only slightly. So remember, these are only averages, statistical averages, and the relationship are not particularly strong. So as risk tolerance is a psychological trait, it can only be assessed accurately using a scientifically validated test like FinaMetrica. So what do I mean by scientifically validated? It's simply a test that is based on psychometrics. Now, psychometrics is not as boring as you think it is. It's actually a marriage of psychology and statistics. It provides a basis for developing a valid and reliable test and standards against which the test can be evaluated. A valid test is simply one that measures what it purports to measure, and a reliable test measures it consistently with known accuracy. The FinaMetrica profile was developed with the assistance of the University of New South Wales and now maintained by the London School of Economics. We have 25 or 12 questions, or in plain English questions. So what that means is you don't need a degree in science to be able to complete the questionnaire. It's designed for the general population to be able to complete the questionnaire without the aid of an advisor. And we do recommend that clients do complete the questionnaire on their own, just so that there are no influence from the advisor when answering the questionnaire. The reliability of the questionnaire is backed by over 1 million completed profiles in over 20 countries. In fact, our reliability the reliability score of our test is actually 0.9 out of 1. Usually for a test to be commercially viable, you need to be at least 0.7, and we've exceeded that by going up to 0.9. So what I'll jump into next is the actual risk tolerance profile. So the system consists of 10 sections, as you can see on the screen there. The first talks about the score and where your client sits in the population. we have the risk group next, and that provides a description of your client's risk group. The differences section provides a table summary of where your client differs from their group. Risk and demographic responses are simply the answers provided by your client. The portfolio gap analysis section provides the link between risk tolerance and asset allocation. And the balance of the report is very self-explanatory. So I'll now explore the first few sections in more detail. So this is the first part of the risk tolerance report. It's a report for John Major, as you can see there, and it talks about John's risk tolerance score. So we measure risk tolerance on a constructed scale from 0 to 100, with the average being 50 and a standard deviation of 10. John's score of 40 here is a low score, lower than 83% of all scores. Again, like most human attributes, risk tolerance has a bell curve distribution in the population, meaning that most of us will cluster around the middle and very few on the lower and upper ends. To make the scores and reports more meaningful, the scale has been divided into 7 segments here, what we call risk groups, where the middle segment is the mean plus minus half a standard deviation, so that it's a score from 45 to 55 here. And then segments either side are then 1 standard deviation, either higher or lower. You notice that only 2% of the population makes up risk group 1 and 7. So do not be surprised if most of your clients comes out with scores around risk group 3, 4, and 5. This is quite typical. Finally, there is a section at the end of your risk tolerance score which talks about how well your client is at estimating their own score. So most people are pretty good at estimating their score. Here you see that John has overestimated by quite a large amount. He thought he was 68 when his actual score was 40. When there is a difference in perception like this, it can be one of 2 things. The first, it could be a data entry mistake when completing the questionnaire. So do go back and check the answers. 1 or 2 mistakes would not make a significant difference. If more mistakes, then a retest is appropriate. The second reason is that it can be a judgment error. John underestimated the population average. He thought he was above average at 68, when in fact he was below average at only 40. On the other hand, if, like most people, he had estimated, say, 30 and came out of 40, then he had overestimated the population average. In either case, ask your clients who they are comparing themselves to. Who are they using as a reference group? I'm now moving on to the risk group section of the profile. So the risk group description reflects the typical answers selected by people within the group. For example, most people in risk group 3 usually feel somewhat optimistic about their major decisions after they make them. However, highlighted in bold and italic under this section, you see that John actually differs from the group. He usually feels somewhat pessimistic about major financial decision after he makes them. Now, typically there will be between 2 to 5 differences. Differences occur because while those within a risk group are similar, they are not clones. People whose scores fall at either end of a risk group tend to have more differences than those with scores in the middle. The number of differences is an indication of how consistent someone is when it comes to financial decision making. So occasionally a person will have many differences, 8 or more, indicating a lack of consistency in financial matters. Of itself, this is not a negative characteristic. Some people are just naturally less consistent than others, but it is helpful to know this at the start of the relationship. The differences are also shown not only in the text of the risk group, but also as a table in the differences section. So here you can see that a green tick means that the answer provided is consistent with the risk group. An orange tick means that it is a difference that is adjacent to the risk group, and this is quite typical. And finally, a red tick indicates that the difference is actually 2 or more risk groups away. In this instance, the red tick is designed to be alarm bells, essentially alerting you to these differences, and they should be discussed with the client. So ask why your client thinks it might be that they chose a lower or high option than is typical of their risk group. But it's important not to make too much of any particular difference. Remember, these are people and not clones. So the risk tolerance score, the overall risk tolerance score, represents an overall evaluation of the answers your clients gave to the questionnaire. These answers will not necessarily be consistent. So as we said earlier, inconsistent answers will be identified as a difference in the report. In some cases, the differences are not material, and in some cases not. So with experience, you will become familiar with the risk group descriptions and be able to quickly identify a material difference. After discussing the risk score, the risk group, and differences with your client, it's good practice to confirm with your client that the report is a true reflection of their risk tolerance. If so, you can accept the score as is by clicking on the Save button next to the agreed score at the top of the report. This will allow you to enter a file note, save the note, and then the score renews for future calculations. Where the client and you feel that an adjusted score is required due to the differences, then an agreed score can be entered. Again, by clicking on Save, you can then change the 40 here to the appropriate agreed score, add a file note indicating why you and the client had decided to adjust the score, save the notes by clicking the Save Notes button, and this will then save the note in the system to be used for the portfolio gap analysis section, where we make the link from risk tolerance to asset allocations. So before I jump straight into the portfolio gap analysis section, I want to briefly touch on the difference between risk profiling and risk tolerance. And sometimes the terms can be used interchangeably. So I just want to clarify how it's used in our system. So risk profiling is a process for finding the optimal level of investment risk for your client, balancing their risk required, risk capacity, and risk tolerance. So The risk required is simply the risk associated with the return required to achieve their goals from the financial resources available. It is a financial calculation. The risk capacity is the level of financial risk the client can afford to take. Again, it's a financial calculation. And finally, risk tolerance is the level of risk the client is comfortable with taking. It's a psychological trait. There is often a mismatch between risk required, risk capacity, and risk tolerance. So to be able to identify such mismatches and to assist your client to resolve it, you need to separate each component to enable an apples to apples comparison. FinaMetrica gives you the first piece of the puzzle, the risk tolerance. That is, how emotionally comfortable your client is with taking risk. The second part of the gap analysis is the risk required and risk capacity calculation. Now, this part is usually done using your financial or planning software to come up with the appropriate portfolio to meet your client's goals and capacity within the right time frame and so forth. So what does a FinaMetrica risk tolerance score of 40 means in terms of investments? Broadly, the expected risk and return of a well-constructed portfolio is determined by its growth defensive split, where defensive includes cash and fixed interest, and growth is your property and shares. A FinaMetrica risk tolerance score can then be expressed in terms of the percentage of growth assets your client will be comfortable with. So that a score of 40 for John equals 32% growth assets, meaning that John will be comfortable with a portfolio that has 32% growth asset in it. However, we know that in a well-constructed portfolio, volatility is not highly sensitive to the percentage of growth assets. Someone who's comfortable with 32% growth asset is likely to be comfortable with, say, 33%, 31%, and so forth. So there is a comfort zone. Here we call it the comfort okay risk zone, where it ranged from 23% to 42% for a score of 40. And remember that risk tolerance is not just an upper limit on a negative. It is a continuum where a person balances the chance of a positive outcome against the chance of a negative outcome. So not only can John be exposed to too much risk, he can also be exposed to too little risk. Hence, there will be a shading in what we call the marginal yellow zone here between comfort and discomfort, so that John will be taking on too much risk should the level of growth asset in his portfolio exceeds 52%. Now, I'm going to switch over to the live side and talk you through the gap analysis process. So this is the John's portfolio in the system. So we've gone through the first few section already about the score, the root, the differences, the responses. And now I want to take you to the asset allocation part, which is portfolio gap analysis. So what you can see is John's oh, sorry, something happened there. Okay, that's better. So what you can see on screen is John's comfort zone for All of, oh, it's 50. I must have adjusted his score. Hold on. Let me just change his score back to 40. And refresh that. And okay. So here we go. John's score of 40, and here's his comfort zones. So as we said earlier, John would be comfortable between, as we can see on the slide here, 23 to 42% growth assets. So this is shown in the green zone. And he would be discomforted should it exceed 52% growth asset. So let's assume that John is considering an investment that is 60% growth assets, because your modeling software has shown that this investment is going to meet John's retirement goals, taking into account his risk capacity and time horizon. So if I just add in a target of 60% growth asset, so what you can see is most people will be in this particular situation. The risk required to achieve his goals is actually more than the risk that the client is emotionally comfortable with taking. So it's outside his comfort zone. There are 3 alternatives to consider, individually or in combination. The first is stick with the 60% target portfolio. Take the additional risk knowing that John will be uncomfortable from time to time, but not too much that he will panic at the sight of a downturn. Or the other option is to lower the risk required, either by spending less and save more, or delay, reduce, or forego goals. Perhaps only a 50% growth asset portfolio, which is slightly above the comfort zone, but less likely to cause a panic when there is a downturn, and sell. You can also configure FinaMetrica to, if you're using a standard set of asset allocation. So here on the left-hand side, let me just select a sample set of portfolio. So let's say you have a standard set of 4 model portfolios that you typically use with your client. So instead of using the target, you can simply overlay your model portfolio across your client's comfort zone. For example, like so. What you can quickly see is that the conservative portfolio John will be comfortable with, the balance and all the others will be outside of John's comfort zone. Now, your modeling would have shown that one of these portfolio would be the required portfolio to meet John's goals and capacity, and you would go through the same process as I've discussed earlier about either taking on the additional risk or reducing the risk required in order for the client to be more comfortable, closer to the client's comfort zone. Model portfolios can be entered in My Portfolio section of the site, and then they'll be able to appear here in the drop down for you to select from. There is no limit to the amount of model portfolio set you wish to enter in the system. You can also add in ad hoc portfolios as you go by clicking here. For example, you can put in a retirement portfolio, tick this, and compare that to the client's comfort zone. So the retirement portfolio may currently be there at 40% growth asset, and that's clearly within John's comfort zone. Now, quite often, clients may not understand what a 50% growth asset portfolio means compared to, say, a 70% growth asset portfolio. To help manage clients' return and risk expectation, FinaMetrica has performed a historical analysis of 11 illustrative portfolios ranging from 0 to 100% growth assets. So that for a portfolio of, say, if we'll go back to our original analysis and select the target portfolio of 60% growth asset, you see that in the last 45 years, the worst fall is 26.1%, and the 10 years real annualized return is 6.4%. So here you can take your client through the process of saying, can you cope with a 26% fall? Will this derail your plan? If your client takes less risk, say only 50%, it drops to 21% fall. And that real annualized return drops to 6.1 instead of 6.4. So as you move up and down the risk spectrum, you see the risk and return trade-offs. If you click on the percentages at the bottom of each table, you open up a detailed report on each of the 11 portfolios, as you can see here. There are 18 different storyboards here. We don't recommend going through every one. Simply pick and choose the ones that are more appropriate for your client. Some of the analysis links back to the questions in the questionnaire. For example, one of the questions asked the expected return as a multiple bank deposit. And here we've done the analysis of it for you. So if your client had selected they expect 2 times the bank term deposit rate, then you see that for a 60% growth portfolio, in the last 40 years, it only met that 20% of the time, and it fell short 80% of the time. Another great analysis is looking at the performance depending on when the portfolio is viewed. So here you see the difference between looking at it monthly, quarterly, half yearly, and yearly. The difference is quite stark. So for monthly, you're looking at falling 29% of the time. And if you looked at it yearly, it only fell 14% of the time. We have the top 10 rises, the top 10 falls, and so forth. So we update these charts annually. The next update is due out in February, which will take into account data up to the end of 2017. Details regarding the illustrative portfolios, asset allocations are shown at the top, and the applicable indices used are shown at the bottom of the report here, if you have any questions. So I'll close that up. And so this then gives you a summary, this table here underneath the gap analysis of the 11 illustrative portfolios, so you can move up and down the risk spectrum and explain the trade-offs to your clients. That brings me to the end of the portfolio gap analysis. As said, everything after that is just self-explanatory. There's footnotes, there's file notes. This is in regards to saving file notes if you're changing the agreed score, and a signature section. And the report can be easily printed and downloaded by clicking the download button up here and save for your reference. So that's the end of the webinar today.